In the early 1990s, Belle Island, located off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, was a small, isolated community that had seen little outside contact. Most of the island's population lived in peace, relying on fishing and mining as their main sources of income. But in the winter of 1994, something would happen that would leave a scar on the island's history. The story begins with a fisherman, an old man named Paul Miller. Paul was no stranger to the freezing waters around the island. He'd spent decades working the seas, navigating the cold with a quiet confidence. But that winter, Paul was not alone. He was joined by his young nephew, Aaron, a man eager to learn the ways of the sea and the harshness of the cold winters. One evening, as a fierce storm began to churn the waters, Paul and Aaron set out to retrieve their fishing nets. The storm was unlike anything they had seen before. The waves rose higher than usual, and the wind howled with ferocity that made even the bravest fishermen uneasy. Still, they pressed on, believing it would pass quickly. But it didn't. As they reached the outermost edges of the island's waters, the boat was suddenly struck by a massive wave. The hull cracked under the pressure, and before Paul or Aaron could react, they were thrown into the freezing water. Both men fought to stay afloat, the icy cold numbing their limbs as they desperately tried to reach the shore. But the storm was relentless. It wasn't until the following morning that the islanders found the boat, capsized and torn apart, but there was no sign of Paul or Aaron. Search parties combed the waters, scoured the shores, and ventured into the treacherous forest, but they found nothing. As the days turned to weeks, the islanders gave up hope. Paul and Aaron had vanished into the storm, swallowed by the sea and the ice. But 2 months later, as the deep winter set in and the snow began to accumulate, something strange happened. A group of hunters, seeking shelter in an old cave near the cliffs, discovered something horrifying. The frozen bodies of Paul and Aaron, buried in a thick layer of ice, as if the cold had preserved them. But the most unsettling part of this discovery wasn't just their frozen corpses. It was the fact that both men appeared to be facing a direction, towards something, as if they had been watching something from the snow-covered hills before they died. To this day, no one knows what they were looking at. But some say that in the dead of winter, when the winds howl and the snow blankets the island, you can still hear faint whispers in the wind. Whispers of the two fishermen, lost in the cold, forever trapped in the icy grip of Belle Island. The small town of Grimswood, nestled deep in the English countryside, has long been known for its eerie beauty. Surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, it's a place where time seems to stand still. But beneath the idyllic surface, there is an unsettling history that the townspeople rarely talk about. It is the story of the winter forest. It all began in the late 1800s, during a particularly harsh winter. A group of travelers, lost and seeking shelter, stumbled upon the woods of Grimswood. They were a mix of strangers, some adventurers, some traders, and a few families who had been making their way through the countryside when the snowstorm hit. With no other shelter in sight, they ventured into the heart of the forest, hoping to find warmth before the storm worsened. But as they journeyed deeper into the trees, the atmosphere changed. The forest, usually full of life, seemed deathly quiet. The air grew heavier and the snow fell thicker. The travelers soon realized they had become disoriented, unable to find their way back out. As night fell, the temperature dropped drastically. One by one, they began to fall victim to the cold. Some froze where they stood, others sought shelter under the thick branches of the trees, but none of them survived. It wasn't until weeks later that the first search party ventured into the woods, only to find the remains of travelers, some frozen stiff, others unnaturally contorted, as though they had been in the grip of terror when they died. But there was one thing no one could explain. The way their eyes were wide open, staring into the dense trees, as if they were watching something or someone. The forest, now known as the Haunted Winter Forest, became a place no one dared to enter. The locals tell a different story than the one that has been passed down through history books. They say the forest is cursed, that something, some dark force, lurks within its snow-covered trees. And every winter, when the snow begins to fall, strange occurrences take place. People hear whispers in the wind, see figures moving between the trees, and feel the sensation of being watched. No one knows for sure what happened to those travelers, or what truly lies within the woods of Grimswood. But every year, when the first snowflakes fall, the townspeople lock their doors, draw their curtains tight, and pray the forest stays where it belongs, deep in the past. In the remote mountain range of the Pacific Northwest, a place known only to the most experienced mountaineers, lies Gertsen Peak. Towering at over 10,000 feet, the mountain is a treacherous place, with jagged cliffs and icy slopes that have claimed the lives of many over the years. But it wasn't until the winter of 2007 that Gertsen Peak became infamous for something much darker than the typical dangers of high-altitude climbing. A group of 4 climbers, Tom, Sarah, Will, and Lila, set out to scale the peak, eager to test their skills and conquer the mighty mountain. Their expedition was planned meticulously. They had the proper gear, the best maps, and all the experience they needed to tackle the harsh conditions. Or so they thought. The storm hit on the second day of their ascent. At first, it was a light snowfall, but soon the weather turned violent. Winds howled, and the temperature plummeted, making every step they took feel like a battle against the mountain itself. As they neared the summit, the storm worsened, and they were forced to seek shelter in a small crevice just below the peak. But that night, something happened that none of them could explain. In the dead of night, Sarah woke to a sound, a low, guttural growl, followed by a scraping noise, like something dragging across the ice. At first, she thought it was just a storm, but then she noticed it. The faint glow of something moving in the snow, just outside their shelter. She woke the others, and they huddled together, peering out into the blizzard. But there was nothing there. No animal, no human figure, just the howling winds and the endless white snow. They tried to convince themselves it was nothing more than their minds playing tricks on them in the extreme cold. But as the hours passed, the sound grew louder. And then, suddenly, their shelter was rocked by a massive force, as if something or someone had slammed into it with tremendous power. The group scrambled to escape, but when they emerged, they found nothing, only the harsh winds and swirling snow. The next morning, Tom was gone. His tracks led to the edge of a sheer cliff, but there was no sign of him. As they searched frantically, Lila found a strange symbol etched into the snow, a symbol she had never seen before. It was a circle, with lines radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel, and at its center, a crude figure resembling a human skull. What followed was a descent into madness. Each member of the group began to experience hallucinations, visions of strange figures in the snow, whispers in the wind, and the unmistakable feeling of being hunted. They never reached the summit. None of them ever made it down. When rescue teams found their bodies weeks later, they were frozen, eyes wide open, staring at the snow-covered peak. And the symbol? It was found again, carved into the ice beside them. Some say the mountain is cursed, that it draws in those who seek to conquer it. Others believe the mountain itself is alive, a dark force that claims the souls of the climbers who dare to challenge its peak. Evershade was a small, isolated village nestled deep in the Scandinavian wilderness. Known for its remote location and harsh winters, it was a place few people ventured to, save for those with a love for the rugged beauty of the icy north. The people of Evershade had long adapted to the brutal winters, building homes with thick walls and tightly sealed windows to withstand the cold. But in the winter of 1963, something happened that would change the village forever. It started with a single disappearance. A young woman named Ingrid was last seen walking home from a market one evening in early December. She had made the short trek from the village center to her cottage, but as the snowstorm picked up, she never arrived. Her family and friends searched for her for days, combing the thick forest and sweeping the snow-covered paths. But there was no sign of Ingrid. No footprints, no tracks in the snow, nothing. Then, after nearly a week, another villager disappeared. This time, it was Henrik, a burly fisherman who was known for his strength and resourcefulness. He had gone out early to check his traps near the frozen river, but he, too, vanished without a trace. The villagers began to grow uneasy. The number of disappearances slowly grew, until nearly half of the village was gone, swallowed by the winter that they had once considered home. As the months passed, more strange occurrences began to take place. People would hear faint cries for help echoing through the winds, but when they ventured out into the snow, there was no one there. Others reported seeing shadowy figures moving just beyond the tree line, But when they followed the figures, they would vanish without a trace. The village was becoming a ghost town, with every night feeling colder and darker than the last. One by one, the remaining villagers began to leave, terrified of what was happening to their homes. But there was one man who refused to leave, an old hermit named Eric, who lived alone at the edge of the forest. Eric was a recluse, known for his eccentricity and strange habits, but he had lived through more winters than anyone could count. He was the only one who believed that the winter was not the cause of the disappearances, but something far more sinister. It was Eric who uncovered the chilling truth. One night, as a heavy snowstorm raged outside, Eric ventured into the forest with a lantern and a rifle. He had heard the whispers of the villagers, the rumors of something lurking in the shadows of the woods, something that had been there long before the first settlers arrived. Eric, determined to uncover the truth, followed the sound of the wind and the faint cries for help that echoed through the trees. After hours of trekking through the snow, Eric reached a small clearing near the riverbank. There, beneath the thick layers of ice, he saw the last thing he expected: shapes moving beneath the frozen surface. Human shapes, twisting and contorting in unnatural ways, trapped within the ice as though they were trying to claw their way out. It was then that Eric understood the true horror of Evershade. The town was not cursed by some dark force, nor was it the result of natural elements. It was the land itself, a malevolent entity that lived within the frozen earth. Every winter, the ice would claim the souls of the villagers, freezing them in time beneath the surface. The land would feed on their fear, their despair, and their agony, trapping them in an eternal, frozen prison. Eric never returned to the village. His body was found days later, frozen in the snow, his eyes wide open in terror, staring toward a clearing where the ice had claimed the souls of Evershade's lost. The village itself was abandoned soon after, its buildings left to rot under the thick snow. Today, the village of Evershade remains a frozen ghost town, covered by decades of snow and ice. The few brave souls who dared enter the area report a strange, unnerving sensation as they walk through the empty streets. Whispers on the wind, cold breath on their necks, and the feeling that they are not alone. But there are no footprints in the snow, no sign of life. Just a cold, frozen reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. The last story takes us to a place where few dare to tread: the peaks of Mount Halder, located in the icy mountains of northern Norway. For centuries, the mountain has stood tall, covered in snow and surrounded by treacherous cliffs, a place that no man should dare to climb. And yet, in the winter of 1999, a group of climbers set out to conquer its icy summit. The group was led by Magnus, a seasoned mountaineer who had scaled some of the most dangerous peaks in the world. He was accompanied by his team: Anna, a young but skilled climber; Eric, a geologist with an unshakable determination; and Lucas, a photographer hoping to capture the beauty of the mountain on film. Together, they believed they could conquer Mount Halder, a mountain that had long been regarded as an enigma by those who lived near it. They began their climb in late December, when the weather conditions were at their worst. The mountain was notorious for its unpredictable storms and extreme cold, but the group pressed on, eager to reach the top. They made their way through the narrow crevices, battling strong winds and biting cold, as they climbed higher and higher. By the time they reached the halfway point, the storm had intensified. The snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, and the temperature had plummeted to dangerous levels. Despite the adverse conditions, Magnus insisted they continue their ascent, believing they could reach the summit before the storm worsened even further. But as they neared the top, something strange happened. Lucas, the photographer, was the first to notice it. He caught sight of a figure, an old man, standing alone near the edge of a cliff, staring out into the distance. The figure was dressed in tattered clothing, and his face was obscured by a thick beard of frost. Lucas called out to man, but the figure did not respond. It simply stood there, motionless, watching the horizon. Anna, Eric, and Magnus turned to look, but when they did, the figure was gone. There was no sign of him, no tracks in the snow, nothing. The storm had intensified, and they were now fully immersed in the blinding whiteout. But the figure haunted Lucas's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen something that shouldn't have been there. As the group continued their climb, The storms worsened, and fear began to creep into their hearts. With each step, they felt as though they were being watched, as though something unseen was following them. The temperature dropped further, and their bodies began to slow, each movement becoming more difficult as the cold seeped into their bones. That night, as they made camp near the summit, strange things began to happen. They heard whispering voices carried by the wind, faint and unintelligible. Anna claimed to have seen shadows moving just beyond the reach of their campfire. But it was when they went to sleep that the true terror began. Magnus awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of something scraping against the ice. He grabbed his flashlight and ventured outside the tent, his breath forming clouds in the air. There, standing in the distance, was a figure again, tall, frozen, and still, just as Lucas had described. But this time, the figure turned to face him. Its icy eyes locked onto his with a gaze that sent a chill deep into his heart. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the mountain's peak, as if beckoning him to follow. Magnus turned to call out to his team, but when he looked back, the figure had vanished, leaving only the snow and the storm behind. Panic set in. The climbers packed up their gear and attempted to make their way back down the mountain. But as they descended, the storm turned into a violent blizzard, obscuring the path and reducing visibility to zero. By the time the search teams found their bodies days later, they were frozen solid, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and disbelief. There were no signs of struggle, no injuries, just the unmistakable mark of the mountain's icy grip. The last photo Lucas had taken, however, showed something haunting. The frozen figure, now clear in the photo, appeared to be smiling, a smile of triumph, as though the mountain had claimed its prize. Mount Halder remained forbidden place, its peak still hidden in the clouds, its chilling mysteries left unsolved. The story of the icebound watcher is passed down by locals who warn travelers to never venture too high. They say the figure is still there, waiting, watching for the next adventure too close. Svalbard, a remote archipelago in the Arctic Ocean, is known for its bleak beauty. Frozen tundra stretches as far as the eye can see, and the northern lights paint the night sky with eerie green hues. But the true terror of this place lies not in its desolate landscape, but in the legends that have long surrounded it. Stories passed down from generation to generation, whispered on the cold winds that howl through the icy landscape. One such story is of a forgotten expedition of 1931, which was lost to time until a team of explorers, led by Dr. William Forsyth, uncovered the chilling truth years later. Dr. Forsyth was an archaeologist and historian, with a fascination for uncovering the mysteries of the Arctic. He had long heard rumors of a group of explorers who disappeared in the early 1930s while attempting to document ancient relics hidden within the ice. The tale was buried under layers of snow, much like the artifacts they were said to have sought. But Dr. Forsyth's curiosity led him to a remote outpost in Svalbard, where he hoped to unearth the truth. He and his team arrived in late October, a month notorious for the looming darkness of the polar night. The sun had barely set, and the long shadows of winter were creeping across the land. As they set up their camp on the edge of a glacial fjord, the temperature plummeted, and the winds picked up, howling across the snow. The eeriness of Svalbard was palpable, and Forsyth couldn't shake the feeling that the place was alive, as though the land itself was watching them. As they began their excavation, they unearthed a series of strange, ice-encrusted relics, wooden carvings of strange creatures, primitive symbols etched into ancient stone, and objects that seemed out of place, even for the harsh conditions of the Arctic. But the most disturbing find was a set of journals, buried deep beneath the ice, belonging to the lost expedition. The journals spoke of horrors that none of the explorers had expected to encounter. They described how the group had discovered an ancient structure buried deep beneath the ice, an eerie, abandoned temple that seemed to defy the harshness of the frozen landscape. But as they ventured deeper into the structure, the explorers began to experience strange phenomena. They heard whispers in the dark, felt cold fingers brushing against their skin, and saw shadowy figures moving just out of sight. The leader of the expedition, Professor Alaric Helverson, began to suffer from vivid nightmares, describing in his journal how the walls of the temple seemed to breathe, and how the statues of the strange, alien figures would change positions when he wasn't looking. The others in the group began to deteriorate mentally, each one experiencing terrifying hallucinations. As the isolation took hold, the expedition's members began to turn on one another. Trust eroded, and soon they were no longer a unified team. The final journal entry, written by Professor Helverson himself, was chilling. We have awakened something. The ice, the cold, it's not just nature. It's something older, something that has always been here, waiting for the warmth of human breath to disturb its eternal sleep. It is coming for us. The night will never end. Dr. Forsyth and his team, reading these accounts, began to feel the same creeping dread that had plagued the lost explorers. The air around them felt heavier with each passing day, and the once clear, icy skies became shrouded in perpetual twilight. Forsyth couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. At night, strange noises echoed from the glacier, scraping, thumping sounds as though something was trying to claw its way out from beneath the ice. As days turned to weeks, the team's morale plummeted. The journal entries described the descent of the lost explorers into madness, and Forsyth's team began to mirror their behavior. Members began to act strangely, whispering to the wind, staring off into the dark for hours, and most disturbingly, one of them, Peter, began to carve strange symbols into the ice, mirroring those found in the ancient temple. One night, after a particularly violent snowstorm, Dr. Forsyth awoke to find Peter standing outside the camp, staring into the blizzard. His eyes were wide, vacant, as though something had taken hold of him. When Forsyth called out to him, Peter turned slowly, revealing a look of absolute horror. His lips trembled as he whispered, "It's coming! The endless night is coming!" Before Forsyth could react, Peter turned and disappeared into the storm. The team never saw Peter again. The following days were filled with dread as the team packed up and attempted to leave, but the storm never stopped. They couldn't find their way back to the outpost, the snow and wind erasing their tracks, the dark night stretching on forever. The more they tried to escape, the deeper they sank into the wilderness, as though the land itself was keeping them there. Then, on the 35th day, Forsyth awoke to find all of his team members gone, their tents abandoned, their equipment untouched. Only the footprints remained, leading toward the glacier. Dr. Forsyth, now alone, made his way to the glacier, where he saw something that stopped his heart. The ice was not as solid as it appeared. Underneath it, he saw shadows, shapes moving within the frozen depths, crawling, shifting as though alive. He understood in that moment that the lost explorers had not perished. They had been consumed by the very land they sought to uncover. The temple was not an ancient relic of human civilization. It was something far older, something buried by the earth itself, a presence that waited in the cold, feeding on the warmth of the living. Forsyth's final journal entry was left half-written. "We are not alone in the dark. It has been here since before men learned to walk, and it will wait until we are all gone. There is no escape from the endless night of Svalbard." Dr. Forsyth was never found. Frostholm, a village tucked away in the frozen mountains of Sweden, was known for two things: its remote beauty and its harsh winters. The town had always been a place of quiet, where the people knew the cold well, and the snow was expected, if not feared, companion. But the village's true horror lay in a secret that had been buried for generations. In 1952, a young couple, Eric and Sophia, newly married and full of hope, made their way to Frostholm, seeking refuge in the harsh winter months. They were told by the locals that the village was a place where people could escape the bitterness of the modern world, where time slowed and the air was thick with history. They settled in a small, quaint cabin, nestled at the edge of the forest, where the snow would not disturb them. But as winter deepened, Eric and Sophia began to notice strange things. The forest around their cabin seemed to grow denser, as though the trees themselves were closing in on them. The nights were filled with unsettling sounds, whispers carried on the wind, footsteps crunching through the snow when no one was there. One evening, Sophia ventured into the woods, hoping to gather firewood. But when she did not return by nightfall, Eric began to panic. He searched frantically, calling her name into the dark, but there was no answer. It wasn't until the next morning that he found her, standing in the forest, frozen solid, her eyes wide open, staring into the distance as though she had seen something that had stopped her heart. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. Sophia's body was not just frozen by the cold. It was as though the ice itself had taken root in her skin, her limbs stiff and contorted in unnatural positions. And beneath the ice, Eric could make out shapes, strange symbols etched into the frozen surface of her skin. Symbols that looked like ancient runes. Desperate, Eric returned to the village, where the elders spoke in hushed tones about the frozen soul, an entity that had once cursed the land long ago. They warned him that the ice was not merely cold. It was alive, and it sought the warmth of human souls to feed its eternal hunger. The village had sacrificed many in the past to keep the curse at bay, but now it was too late. Eric was already marked, and the frost had claimed Sophia's soul. In a final, desperate attempt to save himself, Eric set fire to the cabin, believing it would burn the curse away. But as the flames licked at the cold night air, a terrible thing happened. The snow stopped falling. The wind fell silent, and the forest began to move. Eric never left the village. Dockneys, a remote town situated near Norway's desolate northern coast, had once been a vibrant fishing village, bustling with life during the warmer months. But as winter arrived, the town transformed into a barren and foreboding place. The days became short, and the nights seemed to stretch on forever. The biting cold drove the inhabitants indoors, leaving only a few brave souls to venture out into the snow-covered landscape. The legend of Dockneys was one that had haunted the locals for generations. It was said that the town was built on the site of an ancient burial ground, an old Norse settlement long forgotten by time. The spirits of those buried beneath the land were restless, trapped in an eternal slumber beneath the earth's frozen surface. But it wasn't just the dead that haunted Dockneys. It was a chilling truth that came with their restless spirits. In the winter of 1978, a group of outsiders, eager to uncover the truth behind the legends of Dockneys, arrived in the village. They were a team of researchers from Oslo University, led by Dr. Lena Hallberg, a historian specializing in Norse mythology. The team had been intrigued by the old tales of a powerful curse that was said to grip the village during the winter months. What they didn't realize, however, was that their presence in Dockneys would awaken something far darker than they could have ever imagined. As they settled into the town's only inn, the team began to gather the town's history and speak with the villagers about the strange occurrences that seemed to plague the town year after year. The elderly folk were hesitant to speak at first, as if they were afraid of drawing attention to the curse that hung over them. But after some prodding, one old woman, who went by the name of Ingrid, finally spoke of the legends. Ingrid told the team about the hollow echoes, a phenomenon that occurred every winter. It was said that once the first snowfall blanketed the town, strange sounds would begin to echo through the streets at night. Soft whispers, distant cries, and low, hollow moans that came from deep within the earth. The villagers believed these sounds were the voices of the dead, calling from beneath the frozen ground. But as the whispers grew louder, they were joined by something far more sinister. Shadows that would move on their own, figures that would appear at the edge of town, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Dr. Hallberg and her team were skeptical, dismissing the villagers' stories as mere superstition. They set up their equipment to monitor the town's strange phenomena, planning to spend the coming weeks recording the sounds and attempting to capture any visual evidence of the eerie figures. But as the first week passed, something unexpected began to happen. At night, the group would hear strange noises outside their windows, scraping sounds, as if something was dragging itself across the ground. When they went to investigate, they found nothing but the eerie stillness of the snow-covered streets. Still, the noises grew louder, until one night, Dr. Hallberg and her assistant Simon ventured out into the village to try to trace the sounds to their source. They made their way to the old church on the outskirts of town, the very building that had been erected on the site of the ancient Norse burial ground. The doors creaked open, and as they stepped inside, they were greeted by an overwhelming silence. The air was cold, thick with the smell of age and decay. The faintest trace of frost had begun to form on the pews, and the once gleaming altar was now covered in a thin layer of ice. As Simon began setting up their equipment, Lena ventured toward the back of the church, where a small door led down into the crypts. The moment she stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, her breath turning to mist in the frigid air. The further she descended into the crypt, the louder the whispers became, faint, indistinguishable voices, echoing from the walls. It was as if the very earth was speaking to her. She made her way deeper into the crypt, the air growing colder with every step. Then, in the flickering light of her lantern, she saw something that froze her in place. At the far end of the crypt, partially buried in the ice and snow, was a stone altar. On top of the altar lay a figure. No, not a figure, but a shape encased in ice, its body twisted and contorted as though it had been trapped there for centuries. The face was barely visible, frozen in an agonizing expression of fear and pain. Lena gasped in horror as she realized that the figure was not some ancient relic. It was human, and worse still, it was alive. The whispers grew louder, now echoing in her mind, urging her to flee. But before she could move, the ice around the figure began to crack, and the air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The figure's eyes opened, empty and cold, and it let out a chilling scream, a sound that reverberated through the crypt and sent a jolt of terror through Lena's spine. She turned and ran, stumbling back up the stairs, but the cold followed her. As she emerged into the church, she found Simon standing in the doorway, frozen in place. His eyes were wide, his mouth agape, but he couldn't move. Lena grabbed him, shaking him, but there was no response. His body was as cold as the stone walls, and his skin was turning a pale blue. "Simon," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, we need to get out of here." But it was too late. The church doors slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, trapping them inside. And as the moon rose high above the frozen village, the hollow echoes grew louder, now joined by the sound of scraping claws against stone. In the days that followed, Dr. Hallberg's team vanished one by one. The villagers claimed to have seen the figures, shadowy, distorted forms that moved in and out of the mist, whispering their names, calling them toward the church. Some of the team members tried to leave, but the blizzards would not let them, and the winds would always drive them back. When the search teams arrived weeks later, they found the town empty. The inn was abandoned, the streets covered in a thick layer of snow, and the church, once a beacon of life, stood silent, the only sound the howling wind. The village of Dockneys had become another frozen graveyard, the hollow echoes once again claiming the souls of the living. The last remaining clue to the team's disappearance was found in the crypt beneath the church. It was a journal, half buried in the snow, its pages covered in strange runes that Dr. Hallberg had failed to decipher in time. The final entry was written in a frantic hand. "They are coming. The voices have awakened. The spirits beneath the ice will claim us all. Deep in the heart of the Norwegian fjords, there lies a place known only to those who have ventured too far from the warmth of civilization. Harbinger's Hollow." The town, nestled at the edge of an unforgiving wilderness, had long since been abandoned by the last of its residents. It was a place where even the bravest avoided. Despite its isolation, Harbinger's Hollow was not without its own terrifying legend, a legend that had drawn the curious and the desperate to its doorstep for decades. The tale of Harbinger's Hollow began in 1887, when a group of settlers arrived in the area, eager to establish a community far from the conflicts of the outside world. They had heard stories of the land's strange beauty, of untouched forests and mountains that stretched toward the sky. What they didn't know was that Harbinger's Hollow was no ordinary place. It was cursed, and the darkness that had long lived beneath its surface was waiting for them. The settlers began to notice strange occurrences almost immediately. Their livestock would disappear without a trace. Fires would burn brighter than normal, as though the flames were trying to escape their reach. And worst of all, the town's once vibrant sky would suddenly become choked with an unnatural fog, the air thick and oppressive. But the most terrifying phenomenon was the sun. During the winter months, the light seemed to vanish. It wasn't just the long polar nights that plagued the town. It was something darker, something that had taken hold of the land itself. The sun simply wouldn't rise. One by one, the settlers began to go mad. They would wander the streets at night, eyes wide with terror, muttering in tongues that no one could understand. Some of them left the town, never to be seen again, disappearing into the fog. Those who remained grew more paranoid, locking themselves indoors, whispering about the ancient evil that resided beneath their feet. At the center of Harbinger's Hollow, an old church stood, Its steeple twisted and gnarled as though the structure itself had been contorted by the malevolent forces that haunted the land. The church had once been a symbol of hope and faith for the settlers, but over time it had become a place of dread. Strange symbols had appeared on its walls, and at night the sounds of muffled chanting could be heard coming from within, even though the doors were locked and the windows shuttered. It was rumored that the priests who had built the church had tried to summon something ancient and terrible, but no one could say what it was. In the winter of 1891, the last of the settlers vanished. A few townsfolk had tried to escape the horrors of the hollow, but they too disappeared into the night. The town was left to rot in the frozen wilderness, forgotten by the outside world. But the hollow was far from empty. It waited, and it watched. Fast forward to 1995. A small group of university researchers, led by Dr. Thomas Langdon, set out on an expedition to investigate the long-forgotten town of Harbinger's Hollow. Dr. Langdon was an expert in folklore and had been fascinated by the chilling story of the town for years. He believed that the town's disappearance could be explained. Perhaps it was a case of mass hysteria or an outbreak of disease. But as his team journeyed deeper into the fjords, they found themselves drawn into something far more sinister. The closer they came to Harbinger's Hollow, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The air became heavy, and the temperature dropped sharply. Even in the dead of winter, the group was forced to wear heavy coats and scarves. But it didn't seem to help. The cold gnawed at their bones. They reached the town just after dusk, and the first thing they noticed was how eerily still it was. The buildings, though old and decaying, still stood tall. The church at the center of town seemed to loom over them, its dark windows staring down like hollow eyes. The silence was oppressive, and the team felt as though they were being watched, though no one was around. The town appeared to be empty, and yet there was an unsettling sense of presence, something unseen, waiting in the shadows. Dr. Langdon ordered his team to begin setting up equipment to document their findings. The air around them felt thick, as though it was filled with something invisible, something that weighed heavily on their chest with every breath they took. They began their search in the town square, where the church sat, watching them from a distance. As they moved closer to the building, strange things began to happen. Their equipment malfunctioned. Flashlights flickered. Radios hissed with static. The temperature plummeted further, even though the sun had barely set. Then, as if summoned by the growing tension, the fog rolled in, slowly at first, but soon thick and suffocating. It enveloped the town, wrapping itself around the buildings and streets like a living thing. No one spoke. No one moved. And then the whispering began. It started low at first, a faint sound, like a wind whispering through the trees. But then it grew louder. It sounded like voices, hundreds of them, all speaking at once, but none of them in any recognizable language. The whispers were maddening, the words unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably pleading. Desperate, eerie. Dr. Langdon ordered his team to head back to their vehicles. But as they attempted to leave, they found the fog had closed in on them completely. They couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The air was thick, and the fog pressed against their skin, as though trying to suffocate them. Panic set in. The team tried to call for help, but the radios remained silent. The more they shouted, the more the whispering intensified. It surrounded them from all sides. Some of the team members broke down, crumpling to the ground and clutching their heads as though in unbearable pain. They cried out for help, but their voices were lost in the deafening cacophony of the unseen whispers. One by one, the researchers began to vanish. Dr. Langdon lost sight of his colleagues in the fog, and when he searched for them, he found nothing but their abandoned gear, covered in frost. It was as though they had simply ceased to exist. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was the church door opening, creaking on its ancient hinges, revealing a figure standing in the shadows within. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with glowing eyes that pierced the fog. When the rescue teams arrived weeks later, they found nothing. The town of Harbinger's Hollow was as abandoned as it had been when the last settlers disappeared over a century before. The fog had cleared, and the area was empty, devoid of life. The church stood silent, its windows black and cold, watching the world from within. No trace of Dr. Langdon or his team was ever found. The town of Harbinger's Hollow returned to its eternal slumber, the whispers once again falling silent. The winter winds of Harbinger's Hollow had always carried with them an eerie presence, but no one had yet fully understood just how far the town's curse reached. For decades, it had been dismissed as a forgotten place, lost to time and history, its tragedies buried beneath layers of snow and frost. But for some, the Hollow was never truly gone. Its echoes still lingered, calling out to those who dared to listen. In the spring of 2003, an ambitious young journalist named Ava Sullivan decided to investigate the rumors of Harbinger's Hollow. Armed with nothing but her camera, notebook, and a strong desire to uncover the truth, she made her way north toward the fabled town, intrigued by the strange disappearances that had occurred there over the years. She had heard the whispers that suggested the town wasn't entirely gone, that something or someone still lurked in the fog. Ava arrived in a nearby town, several miles from Harbinger's Hollow, where she made inquiries about the ghost town. The locals were hesitant to speak at first, their eyes narrowing with apprehension whenever Harbinger's Hollow was mentioned. They spoke in hushed tones, as though the mere mention of the place could summon something dark. Eventually, a grizzled old man, who introduced himself as Magnus, relented and shared his own experience. Magnus told Ava that he had once been a child living in the village closest to Hollow. He recalled hearing the same unsettling whispers that others had spoken of. His family had once ventured near the outskirts of the town during an unseasonably warm winter, but after spending only a few hours there, they fled in terror, forever haunted by the chilling atmosphere and the strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. He warned Ava that no one who ventured into Harbinger's Hollow ever returned the same, or at all. Despite the warnings, Ava pressed on. With a stubborn resolve and the desire to make a name for herself, she journeyed deeper into forest toward the Hollow. The weather was unseasonably cold, the wind howling through the trees, and the further she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It felt as if something was watching her, moving just beyond the periphery of her vision. She reached the outskirts of the town just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long, unnatural shadows across the snow-covered ground. The town seemed unchanged from the photographs she had studied, silent, still, and frozen in time. The air was thick with fog, and the once proud church loomed in the center of the ghost town like a sentinel, its windows black, void of any warmth or light. But it wasn't just the church that caught her attention. There was a strange, almost magnetic pull, drawing her toward the town square. She could feel it, a faint hum beneath the surface of the snow, a vibration, a low pulse that seemed to come from the very ground beneath her feet. Ava set up her camera, eager to capture footage of the site that had been largely untouched for over a century. As she filmed the surrounding buildings, she caught something moving in the corner of her eye, just a flicker, but enough to make her heart race. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. She dismissed it as her mind playing tricks on her, the isolation and coldness of the place getting to her. But as the fog began to thicken, she could feel her nerves beginning to unravel. The air grew colder, heavier, and the fog seemed to swallow her whole, reducing her visibility to mere feet ahead of her. The world around her became a labyrinth of shadows, the once familiar town now utterly foreign and menacing. With each step, the whispers began to return. Soft at first, a murmur in the distance, but then louder, closer, almost as if they were coming from the ground itself. Ava paused and glanced down, expecting to see something, anything that could explain the eerie sensation gnawing at the pit of her stomach. But there was only the frozen earth beneath her boots and the silent, oppressive air around her. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog. Ava froze. The figure was tall and gaunt, its body obscured by the thick mist, but its glowing eyes pierced through the fog like a beacon. Ava instinctively reached for her camera, but her hand trembled. She could barely bring herself to raise the lens. She had heard stories of such figures, the manifestations of the Hollow's curse. They were said to be the lost souls of the town, forever trapped between the world of the living and the dead, their bodies forever bound to the land. The figure began to move toward her, its long, skeletal hands stretched out in front of it. The whispers grew louder, and Ava felt as though they were inside her head, filling every corner of her mind with a terrifying pressure. And then, as the figure closed the distance, it spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The voice was low and raspy, like a whisper from the grave, but there was a strange familiarity to it, as though it were calling her by name. "Ava!" Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. She backed away slowly, but the figure continued to approach, its pace unnaturally fast despite its frail appearance. The mist seemed to swirl around it, coiling like a living thing. Ava turned and ran, her feet slipping on the icy ground, but the figure's presence was inescapable. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more urgent. "Ava, join us!" She stumbled, falling to ground as she tried to push herself back up, but the fog was closing around her, wrapping around her like a noose. Panic surged through her as she gasped for air, struggling to stand against the crushing weight of the atmosphere. But the figure was upon her, and before she could scream, everything went black. When Ava woke, she found herself lying in the town square. The fog had lifted, and the air had warmed ever so slightly. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow over the silent ruins. Ava's camera was still clutched tightly in her hands, but when she tried to raise it, she noticed something chilling. The footage on the screen showed nothing. There was no figure, no town, no mist, just the quiet emptiness of the snow-covered ground. The lens was dark, as if the camera had not captured anything at all. She sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. The town was completely still, no signs of life, no sounds except the wind rustling through the abandoned streets. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about the silence, something unnatural. It felt like the town was holding its breath, waiting. Ava's fingers trembled as she checked her watch. The time was frozen in a moment that felt like it had been stretched out beyond the normal flow of time. Then she heard it again, the whispers. This time, they weren't distant. They were right next to her, close enough that she could feel them reverberating in her skull. She whipped around, searching frantically for the source. But there was no one there, no figure, no movement, only the hollow sound of her own breathing. "Ava!" Her name came again, clearer now, and it was the last thing she heard before everything went dark once more. The winter of 2007 brought with it a new wave of curiosity about Harbinger's Hollow. For years, the stories surrounding the cursed town had circulated as nothing more than ghost stories. Spooky tales told around campfires and whispered about in dark corners of bars. But for some, the truth behind these stories was too enticing to ignore. The world had grown more connected, with people sharing their experiences across the globe, and so the whispers about Harbinger's Hollow, a place supposedly lost to time, began to resurface. It was a place of fascination, a place waiting for its truth to be revealed. 2 years after Ava Sullivan's disappearance, a team of 4 investigative journalists, known for uncovering mysterious and often dangerous locations, decided to travel to Harbinger's Hollow. They had heard about the chilling events surrounding the town, but they weren't afraid of the legends. Instead, they saw it as an opportunity to uncover the truth behind the rumors. The team, led by reporter David Grant, was composed of Sarah, a paranormal investigator, Mark, a seasoned cameraman, and Claire, an expert in cryptic history and urban legends. They arrived in a region with only a vague map and a camera crew, ready to capture any signs of the supernatural, sure that what awaited them would be no different from the many haunted places they'd investigated in the past. As they made their way deeper into the dense forest, they noticed how unnaturally silent the environment had become. The wind no longer rustled through the trees. The typical sounds of wildlife, even the distant calls of birds, were absent. The air felt heavy, like it was suffocating beneath the pressure of some unseen weight. Sarah, sensing the change in atmosphere, pulled out a series of devices, her instincts telling her that something was wrong. "I don't like this," she muttered, scanning the surroundings with a spectral analyzer. "There's something in the air, something we're not supposed to see." David gave her a reassuring smile, but even he couldn't deny the unease creeping into his mind. They had arrived late in the afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged mountains in the distance. As they neared the abandoned town, the temperature dropped sharply. The cold was almost unnatural, biting into their skin and gnawing at their bones. By the time they reached the outskirts of Harbinger's Hollow, the first hint of dusk had settled in. The fog that had been absent on their journey now began to roll across the land, curling like a living entity, creeping closer to them with every passing second. The town itself stood before them, a series of old, decaying buildings that seemed to be frozen in time. The once thriving community had become a ghost town, its streets covered in snow and ice, the windows of the buildings dark and hollow, as though the town had never truly been alive. David adjusted his coat, signaling for the team to prepare their equipment. "Let's get this over with," he said, though even his voice sounded uncertain, carrying a slight tremor. The team slowly ventured into the town, their steps muffled by the snow beneath them. As they approached the center of Harbinger's Hollow, they saw the church, the landmark that had once been a symbol of life for the settlers but had now taken on an even darker significance. Its windows were shattered, the doors slightly ajar as if beckoning them in. Claire, the history expert, was the first to speak. "This place is ancient," she whispered, studying the details of the church's facade. "The architecture doesn't match anything we've seen around here. There's something older, far older, beneath it all." Mark, ever the skeptic, snorted, "Old doesn't equal supernatural, Claire. Let's just get some footage and get out of here. We got work to do." David nodded in agreement, though his eyes kept flickering toward the church, unsettled by the oppressive presence that loomed in the air. As night fell, the temperature plunged even further. The group set up camp in one of the abandoned homes. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with silence, the walls marked by ancient stains and the scent of mildew. They worked in relative quiet, each of them aware of the eerie quiet surrounding them, yet unable to explain it. They had all seen places like this before, but none of them had ever felt the way they did now. The heavy dread that seemed to permeate the air, suffocating them with each passing minute. Around midnight, the first sign of something strange occurred. The wind outside began to howl louder than before, rattling the fragile windows. But it was not the wind that caught their attention. It was a sound from within the house. At first, it was just a faint noise, barely audible, a soft thudding like footsteps. Then, as it continued, it grew louder, more distinct, and it seemed to be moving toward them. "Did anyone else hear that?" Mark asked, his voice low, his eyes darting around the room. David stiffened. "It's probably just the house settling," he said, though even he didn't believe it. The thudding continued, now followed by a faint scraping sound, as if something or someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. They froze, their breath caught in their throats, as the scraping sound intensified. It was coming from the room adjacent to theirs. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Stay close," David ordered, motioning toward the doorway. He grabbed his flashlight and began walking toward the source of the sound, the rest of the group following him in silence. They reached the door of the room, the thudding and scraping now deafening. But as David opened the door, the room was empty. No furniture had been moved, no sign of anything that could have made the sounds. Claire, wide-eyed, looked around in confusion. "This is impossible." And then the whispers came, soft at first, but growing louder. "David, Sarah, Mark." The team stepped back in shock as the whispers seemed to surround them. They reached out, closing in, their voices blending into a guttural hum that echoed in their minds. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, frost beginning to form on the walls and floor. Sarah's breath turned into clouds of mist in front of her as she stumbled backward. "What is happening?" she gasped, her voice shaking. Before anyone could respond, a shadow moved the far end of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form bathed in a black fog. For a moment, it stood perfectly still, as if studying them, before it began to move toward them. Its face was featureless, nothing but a void in the shape of a man. The air around it seemed to twist, distorting the very space, as though it was not quite part of the world they inhabited. David stumbled back, raising his camera to capture the figure, but as he did, the camera screen went black. His fingers trembled as he tried to adjust it, but it refused to turn on. The figure was getting closer now, its form looming over them, the whispers now so loud they felt like they were being torn apart from within. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside. Panic surged. "Get out! We need to leave!" Mark shouted, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt as though the very house was holding them prisoner. The whispers continued to grow, filling the room with a maddening cacophony. The shadows danced on the walls as if alive, their movements jerky and unnatural. In the center of the room, the figure stepped forward, its eyes, if you call them eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Join us," it whispered, its voice reverberating deep within their skulls. And in that moment, they understood. The hollow didn't want them gone. It didn't want them to escape. It wanted them as part of its curse. Forever. Harbinger's Hollow, now an unsettling name in the annals of unsolved disappearances, had once again claimed its victims. The group of journalists was not the first to vanish within the cursed town, and they certainly wouldn't be the last. But what they failed to understand was that Harbinger's Hollow didn't simply trap souls. It erased them, leaving no trace behind, no evidence that they had ever existed at all. Weeks passed after the disappearance of David Grant and his team. The world moved on, as it often does when a story grows cold. The police made little headway. No bodies were found. No real clues emerged. But something lingered, something unspeakable. Those who still remembered Harbinger's Hollow couldn't shake the feeling that the town itself was not just haunted by ghosts, but by an ancient, insidious force, one that could reshape reality itself. It wasn't until the winter of 2009 that the stories resurfaced once more, but this time, the whispers would not be contained. Elliot Hawkins was a seasoned investigative reporter from a major metropolitan news outlet. He had heard about Harbinger's Hollow, of course. Who hadn't? But unlike his predecessors, he wasn't content with hearing stories or reading about it. No, he wanted answers, real answers. The mystery of the Hollow had become an obsession for him, something he could not shake. His sources, former locals, urban explorers, even scholars of the paranormal, spoke in hushed tones of the town's terrible power, but none had dared to go further than a few hundred feet past the border of the cursed land. Most had learned their lesson long ago. But Elliot was different. His career depended on finding stories others were too afraid to touch, and Harbinger's Hollow was a holy grail of investigative reporting. He was confident he could expose the truth, debunk the myths, and walk away with a Pulitzer-worthy scoop. And so, Elliot set out alone, armed only with a camera, a GPS tracker, and a determination that bordered on arrogance. He drove north, deep into the wilderness where Harbinger's Hollow was said to lie. The trip was grueling, the road narrowing until it became a thin, winding path covered in snow and ice, surrounded by dark trees that seemed to close in on him. But Elliot pressed forward, brushing off the sense of foreboding that whispered in the back of his mind. By the time he arrived at the outskirts of Harbinger's Hollow, night had fallen, and the landscape before him was bathed in an eerie, unnatural quiet. He parked his truck at the edge of the forest, grabbed his gear, and made his way toward the town. His breath formed misty clouds in the freezing air, but he barely noticed it. There was something else in the air, something heavier than just the cold. It was a feeling, an instinctive knowing that something was wrong. As he stepped closer to the town's border, he saw the church's silhouette looming in the distance, its spire piercing the twilight. The fog began to creep in from all sides, wrapping itself around him like an insistent whisper. But still, Elliot moved forward. He'd come too far to turn back now. The town was still, unnervingly so. Buildings stood like hollowed-out husks, frozen in a time long forgotten. The fog clung to everything, thickening as he moved deeper into town. Elliot's flashlight barely penetrated the swirling mist, and his every step seemed to echo through the frozen streets, bouncing off the snow-covered ground like a distant voice calling for help. "Okay," he muttered to himself. "Let's get this over with." He began filming, capturing footage of the church, the surrounding buildings, the empty streets. Anything he could use to piece together the history of this forsaken place. But as he panned his camera toward a dilapidated house at the end of the street, something caught his eye. Something that wasn't there a moment ago. A figure. It was just a shadow at first, but as Elliot's camera zoomed in, he saw the outline of a tall, thin shape standing motionless in the doorway of the house. It was humanoid, but there was something about it that felt wrong. Its proportions were off, its arms too long, its head too large, and the faintest hint of light glimmered from behind its features. But there was no visible face, only a darkness that seemed to bleed out from it. Elliot's heart raced. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His instincts screamed at him to run, to turn and flee from this place, but he forced himself to stay still, to keep the camera trained on the figure. His fingers shook as he zoomed in further, but before he could capture another frame, the figure vanished. For a moment, Elliot thought his mind had betrayed him, that it was just his fear playing tricks. But then the whispers came. They were soft at first, as if carried on wind, but they grew louder, more insistent. They wrapped themselves around him, crawling into his ears, into his brain. He turned, trying to find the source, but there was no one there, only the fog, thick and consuming. He felt his pulse quicken, his breath turning shallow. "This is insane," he muttered to himself. "I'm just imagining things." But then, in the fog, he saw movement again. The figure. Only this time, it was much closer. It stood just a few feet away. Its shape more distinct now, its elongated fingers reaching toward him, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and as its featureless face came into view, Elliot's stomach twisted into a tight knot. He couldn't see eyes, but he could feel them staring into him, into his very soul. "Ava," it whispered in a voice that was not human. The name echoed in his mind, familiar yet foreign. Elliot stepped backward, trying to steady his breathing. "Ava? What the hell?" He didn't have time to finish his sentence before the figure lunged. The air grew colder, almost unbearable, as the figure reached out with its impossibly long arms, its fingers brushing against his skin like icy blades. He screamed, dropping his camera, but the sound of his voice was swallowed by the fog, disappearing into the void. The world around him began to spin, the darkness pressing in on all sides. For a moment, everything was still, and then everything went black. When the rescue team arrived a few days later, they found only Elliot's camera, still recording in the snow. The footage was unremarkable, just the same empty streets, the same cold, lifeless buildings. But when they checked the timestamp on the video, they found that the last frame was taken just minutes before the camera had been dropped. There was no sign of Elliot, no footprints, no trace of him anywhere. The town of Harbinger's Hollow had claimed yet another soul. The year was 2011 when the next chapter of Harbinger's Hollow's dark history began to unfold. By now, the town had become a chilling legend, a place so steeped in death and mystery that anyone who dared to seek it out would surely vanish. But despite the warnings, some people remained drawn to the Hollow, intrigued by the myth, by the allure of what lay hidden beneath its cursed layers. This time, however, the story would take a different turn. It was a bitterly cold winter when Dr. Amelia Lawson, a professor of folklore and occult studies, found herself standing at the edge of Harbinger's Hollow. Amelia had spent years researching the paranormal, but Harbinger's Hollow had always been an enigma she couldn't crack. Her research, filled with old maps, documents, and scattered records, had led her to believe that the town's curse was more than just a superstition. It was a manifestation of something much older, something darker than anyone could comprehend. Amelia wasn't just seeking answers for academic reasons. She had a personal stake in the Hollow. Her younger brother, Thomas, had gone missing a decade earlier after a trip to the town. He had been one of the many drawn to its sinister reputation, and after a few days of silence, he too had disappeared without a trace. The disappearance had never been solved, and it had haunted her ever since. Now, as a respected scholar, Amelia knew she had to go to Harbinger's Hollow herself to uncover the truth, if not for her career, then for the closure she so desperately needed. Armed with nothing but her extensive knowledge of folklore and the town's history, Amelia approached the outskirts of the Hollow, the winds biting at her face as she walked toward the decaying town. The fog, as always, clung to the ground, thickening with every step she took. The sense of foreboding grew heavier with each breath, but Amelia pushed it aside. She was prepared for this. She had to be. The silence of the town was suffocating, as though the very air itself had been frozen in time. Amelia had visited many places with dark histories, but nothing compared to the deep, unsettling quiet that filled Harbinger's Hollow. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir, as if afraid of awakening something ancient buried within the town's decaying walls. She moved cautiously through the town, documenting her findings with careful notes and photographs. The houses were still standing, though some were barely recognizable as buildings anymore, reduced to rotting husks of their former selves. The church loomed at the center of the town, dark and foreboding, like the watchful eye of an ancient entity. She couldn't help but feel that it was alive in some way, watching her every move, waiting. But it wasn't the church that called to her. It was the old cemetery at the edge of the town. As Amelia approached, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The cemetery was far older than the rest of the town, its gravestones crumbling and overgrown with ivy. Yet what stood out most were the markings on some of the tombstones. They weren't just names and dates. There were strange symbols etched into the stone, runes and patterns that seemed to pulse faintly in the light. Amelia crouched beside one of the graves, tracing her fingers over symbols. The runes were not just ornamental. They were part of an ancient language, one she had seen in her studies but never truly understood. They were connected to a curse, one that had been placed on the land long before Harbinger's Hollow had ever been founded. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, realizing that the answers she had been seeking were within her grasp. This was it. The key to the mystery of the Hollow lay here in the cemetery. But before she could examine further, a sound cut through the silence, a faint scraping, followed by a low, guttural groan. Amelia froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was not just in the wind. It was coming from the earth beneath her feet. The ground beneath the cemetery shifted, the icy earth groaning, as though something was stirring beneath the frozen surface. Amelia took a step back, the realization settling over her like a cold fog. The Hollow was alive, but it wasn't the town itself. Something darker, something buried for centuries, was waking. The earth split open with a low rumble, and from the ground emerged the figure of a man. His body was twisted, frozen in place, his features covered in layers of ice and dirt. Yet his eyes, dark and hollow, like two pits of despair, were fixed on her. "Amelia," the figure rasped, his voice crackling like frozen wind. "You shouldn't have come. This place, it's cursed. All of us are cursed." The words froze Amelia in place. She recognized the voice instantly. Thomas! Her heart raced, and for a moment, everything around her went still. The figure in front of her was her brother, but something was wrong. So very wrong. He wasn't just lost to the Hollow. He was part of it now, trapped in whatever dark force governed this cursed land. "Thomas," she whispered, stepping closer, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" The figure's lips curled into a grotesque, frozen smile. I never left," he whispered. "I am here with them." He motioned toward the gravestones around him, each one now seemingly alive with dark, shadowy energy. The runes glowed faintly, the air around them vibrating with the power of whatever curse had taken root in Harbinger's Hollow. Amelia's eyes widened in horror as shadows began to rise from the graves. Figures emerged, hollow, featureless beings, their bodies wrapped in tattered rags, their faces blank before the emptiness that stared back. The air grew colder, the ground beneath her feet trembling. The Hollow never lets go. Thomas's voice echoed, distorted and inhuman now. "We are its prisoners, and so will you be." The shadows closed in, their movement swift and unnatural. Amelia's heart pounded as she spun on her heel and ran, but the fog swallowed her, cutting off her escape. No matter how fast she ran, the air grew colder, and the shadows drew closer, whispering her name, calling her to join them in the eternal darkness of the Hollow. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the snow, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The temperature had plummeted, and she felt the cold gnawing at her bones. Her mind raced. She had to escape, had to find a way to break the curse. But there was no way out. The town had already claimed her. "Amelia." Thomas's voice echoed again, now a chorus of voices rising from the depth of the Hollow. "Join us. It's too late for you," she screamed, her voice lost in the howling winds. But as the shadows closed in, a sudden clarity hit her. The runes, the graveyard, everything had been connected. The curse of the Hollow wasn't just about the souls it trapped. It was about feeding. It absorbed the living and the dead, consuming them all into an eternal cycle. There was no way out. The last thing Amelia saw was the twisted figure of her brother, his hollow eyes staring back at her as the shadows enveloped her, dragging her into the frozen depths of Harbinger's Hollow. It was the beginning of winter when Emily Cartwright, a seasoned paranormal investigator, first heard whispers about Harbinger's Hollow. It had been over a year since Dr. Amelia Lawson had disappeared, and with her sudden vanishing, the stories of the town's curse had surged back into public consciousness. Emily had read every article, watched every documentary, and scoured every piece of information she could find. The mystery surrounding Harbinger's Hollow intrigued her like no other. A place where people vanish without a trace, a town frozen in time, its dark secrets buried beneath layers of ice and snow. She knew she had to investigate. Emily wasn't like the others. She was methodical, experienced, and used to navigating the unknown. But Harbinger's Hollow was different. It was a place where logic failed, where the usual rules of science and reason no longer applied. Yet, it was the perfect challenge for someone like her. She packed her equipment, grabbed her camera, and set out to uncover what had claimed so many lives before her. The drive to Harbinger's Hollow was longer than she anticipated, the roads winding through dense forests that were quickly becoming a frozen wasteland. The air was thick with the silence of the snow-covered world around her. Her breath fogged the window as she glanced at the old map she had found, marking the location of the hollow. There was an ominous energy to the place, an ancient pull that seemed to draw her closer. As Emily approached the town's limits, she felt the temperature drop sharply. The moment she crossed the boundary where the trees thinned and the fog began to rise, an uneasy chill settled in her chest. It was as if the land itself had become an entity, watching her, waiting for her to make her move. The hollow lay ahead, silent, cold, and foreboding. Upon entering the town, Emily could almost feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. The fog rolled in thicker now, obscuring her vision. The buildings, once homes to people, now stood like hollowed shells, their windows dark and empty. The streets were eerily quiet, not a single sound, no animals, no wind. It felt unnatural, as though the town itself was holding its breath. She set up her camera to document the scene. Her hands moved quickly, professional, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the camera was capturing something more than just the empty streets. A sensation lingered in the air, something faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. Emily could feel the eyes of the town on her. The fog swirled around her feet, like a living thing, curling around her ankles and making every step feel heavier, more labored. She reached the center of the town, where the church stood like a towering monument to some forgotten deity. The spire jutted into the sky, a dark silhouette against the gray mist. It was as if the town itself had been suspended in a moment of frozen time, stuck between reality and something far worse. Emily's pulse quickened, but she fought against a growing sense of dread. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. She approached the church, her footsteps muffled in the thick snow. The door creaked open as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was thick with dust and neglect. The pews were covered in layers of frozen snow and ice. The stained glass windows were cracked, the colors distorted by time. Emily stepped deeper into the cold darkness, the only sound a faint echo of her breath. She pointed her flashlight toward the altar, her heart hammering in her chest. And then she saw it. At the base of the altar, lying against the stone floor, was a piece of paper yellowed with age. Emily crouched down and carefully picked it up. It was a journal, or rather, it had once been a journal. The cover was worn and cracked, the pages fragile. She flipped it open to the first entry. The hollow calls to us. We are not meant to leave. The land beneath our feet holds power older than time itself. It waits for us to succumb to its darkness. It has already taken us. There is no escape. The word sent a shiver down her spine. This was not just an account of some haunted town. This was a warning, a confession. The rest of the journal was a rambling mess of scribbles and incoherent thoughts. But one thing stood out. The last entry was dated just days before the town's final disappearance. The last night Amelia Lawson had been seen. They are all here now. All the souls who have fallen into the hollow. We have become part of it, and it will never let go. We are not the first, and we won't be the last. It is coming for you. It waits for those who are foolish enough to trespass. Emily's hands shook as she set the journal down. The air felt heavier now, thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to pulse with every beat of her heart. The fog outside had thickened, and the cold was unbearable. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sound, a low hum, like a distant whisper, curling through the church. Emily turned sharply, her flashlight flickering in the dim light. She couldn't see where it was coming from, but she could feel it, the presence. Something was watching her. She wasn't alone. The hum grew louder, and then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slowly at first, but with increasing intensity, like something or someone was moving toward her. Emily grabbed her camera and began filming, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The footsteps grew louder, and the shadows in the church seemed to shift and writhe. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement, something dark and formless creeping along the edges of the room. She backed toward the door, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. A voice, not human, whispered her name. Emily, Emily. It was not a voice she recognized. It was cold, hollow, and ancient. Suddenly, she was not alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, hollow-eyed, featureless, their forms made of darkness and cold. They circled her, their movements slow, deliberate. She tried to run, but her legs fell frozen to the spot, her body unwilling to move. A dark figure stepped forward from the group. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the shape. It was Thomas, the figure from the journal. But now, his eyes were nothing but hollow voids, his face frozen in an expression of agony. His body, stiff and unyielding, moved as if it was a marionette being controlled by an unseen force. "You shouldn't have come." The voice came from Thomas, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was a collective voice, filled with the echoes of every soul that had been lost to Harbinger's Hollow. Emily tried to scream, but her voice was lost, swallowed by the air. The figures closed in, their cold, grasping hands reaching for her. She could feel the ice crawling up her skin, creeping into her bones, numbing her body as they dragged her toward the altar. As the shadows enveloped her, Emily realized the truth too late. Harbinger's Hollow didn't just trap the living. It consumed them body and soul, and now would claim hers too. The last thing Emily saw was Thomas's hollow eyes staring into hers, and the whisper, "There is no escape." Years passed, and the legend of Harbinger's Hollow began to fade from the public eye. The last known attempt to uncover the town's secrets had been a failed investigation. The disappearance of Emily Cartwright sealed by the chilling evidence she left behind. The Hollow had consumed her too, just as it had done to everyone before her. The land remained silent, waiting, always waiting for the next victim to wander too close. But as time wore on, there were whispers, rumors that the town had started to stir once again. It was 2016 when Gavin Blackwood, a determined and highly skeptical urban explorer, decided to test the legend for himself. Gavin had built a name for himself investigating paranormal sites, documenting his experiences through photography and blog posts. He had always prided himself on debunking myths, uncovering the truth behind urban legends. Harbinger's Hollow, with its grotesque history and lingering mystery, became his next project. The chilling tales of those who disappeared in the town fueled his curiosity, and despite the warnings from fellow explorers, he couldn't resist. He was determined to prove that the Hollow was nothing more than a collection of old stories, the product of superstition and imagination. The first signs of something wrong came before he even entered the town. The moment Gavin crossed the boundary into the desolate area surrounding Harbinger's Hollow, his equipment malfunctioned. His phone died, the screen flickering before going completely black. His camera's battery drained faster than he could recharge it, and the GPS system began to glitch. Even his watch, normally reliable, stopped ticking altogether, as if time itself had taken a break in this forsaken place. But Gavin pushed on. He had faced worse. Haunted houses, abandoned asylums, and even the notorious urban legends of his day. The eerie fog that rolled in like a living creature was unsettling, but it was nothing he hadn't dealt with before. His feet crunched in the fresh snow, the sound of his steps swallowed by the thick silence that hung heavy in the air. Harbinger's Hollow was as he expected, decayed, forgotten, and seemingly abandoned. The streets were lined with dilapidated houses, their windows shattered, their doors ajar as they had been hastily abandoned. The church, still standing at the heart of the town, loomed like a black monument to something far older than it appeared. But something was different. There was a palpable sense of unease in the air, a dark undercurrent that sent a shiver down Gavin's spine. The wind whispered to the bare trees, but there were no sounds of wildlife, no birds, no rustling of branches. It was as if the town itself had sucked the life from the land around it. Gavin entered the church, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The floor creaked beneath him, the scent of mildew and decay thick in the air. The altar, untouched by time, stood as a grim reminder of the town's sinister past. But as Gavin's flashlight passed over pews, something caught his eye. There, among the dust and snow, lay an old journal, its leather cover worn and brittle. His heart raced. It was a find like none other. This was the kind of discovery that would elevate his status in the world of paranormal investigation. He opened the journal with trembling hands, his breath fogging up the cold air. The first entry was dated in 1905. The curse of this town is real. It is not of this world, and it is not something that can be explained by mere superstition. We are prisoners here, all of us. Those who enter never leave. I have seen the shadows take those who were once like me. Now they are part of the darkness, and I fear I shall be next. Gavin turned the page, and his pulse quickened. We did not know what we were summoning when we built this town. The land had its own will, its own hunger. It is not a town, but a vessel, a trap. It draws the souls of those who are weak, who are curious, and it binds them to the earth. Forever. He turned another page, and this entry was different. It was hastily written, the ink smeared in places. I hear them now. The ones who are trapped, they whisper my name. They tell me that I will join them soon. The hollow calls for me. It waits for the next victim, the next fool to wander too far. Please, I beg you, do not come. Do not listen to the lies. Do not step onto this cursed land. Gavin's hands shook as he turned to the final page. There, scrawled in desperate, frantic writing, was one last plea. If you find this, turn back. Do not stay. For if you do, you will become one of them. You will never leave, and your soul will be devoured by the hollow. It was too late. Before Gavin could react, he felt a sharp, cold wind blow through the church. The temperature dropped to a bone-chilling level, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twitch in the corners of his vision. His flashlight flickered again, then went out completely. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled with the batteries, his breath now coming in quick, panicked bursts. But the darkness was not absolute. Through the small gaps in the church's windows, Gavin saw something moving. Figures, shapes, emerged from the fog outside, slowly advancing toward the church. His blood ran cold. They were not human. Gavin backed toward the altar, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figures were tall, their bodies draped in tattered rags, their faces obscured by dark, empty hoods. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, like puppets being controlled by unseen hands. And the air, thick with the scent of rot and decay, seemed to press in on him, suffocating him in its grip. They were coming closer, slowly, steadily. He turned to run, but the church door slammed shut with a deafening thud, trapping him inside. The shadows around him grew, darkening the corners of the room as the figures stepped closer. The whispers in the air were unmistakable now, low, guttural sounds, calling his name. Gavin! Gavin! He turned in circles, trying to find an escape, but there was none. The floor beneath him seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and the walls seemed to close in. Desperation set in as he realized the truth. Harbinger's Hollow wasn't a ghost town. It wasn't just a place lost in time. It was a prison for souls, a place where the living became part of the curse, bound forever to the land. He had been drawn in, just like the others before him, and now there was no escape. The figures advanced, their movements becoming more deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. Gavin's breath quickened, his chest tight as the first of them reached him. The hollow, lifeless face of one of the figures loomed before him, and as it opened its mouth, a freezing cold filled the air. Welcome to the hollow. The voice was not a sound, but a presence, a presence that filled his mind with an unbearable weight. The last thing Gavin saw was the outstretched hand of the figure reaching for him, and the darkness swallowing him whole. The year was 2023 when Kyle Hargrove, an ambitious paranormal investigator from the city, first heard the chilling rumors of Harbinger's Hollow. He had heard of the place before, but like most people, he dismissed it as a product of superstition. But as the story spread again through social media and the growing influence of online forums, Kyle found himself unable to resist. He saw a perfect opportunity to investigate the town's curse, to uncover its dark secret, and to finally prove or disprove the urban legend once and for all. Kyle wasn't new to the paranormal world. He had made a name for himself by exploring haunted houses, abandoned hospitals, and forgotten prisons, places where death lingered in the air, places steeped in mystery. Yet, Harbinger's Hollow felt different. There was something deeper, something more dangerous about it. The locals still spoke of it in hushed tones, and every failed attempt to uncover its secrets only seemed to fuel the legend further. The story of Gavin Blackwood's disappearance weighed on him. A well-known investigator in his own right, Gavin had entered the Hollow seeking to debunk its mystery, only to vanish, leaving behind a camera and the faintest of clues. Kyle couldn't understand why someone so experienced had been drawn in and claimed by the town. If someone like Gavin couldn't escape, what chance did he have? But Kyle's need to confront the unknown outweighed his fear. He packed his gear, checked his equipment, and set off. He made sure to bring enough supplies for several days. He wasn't going in without preparation. The drive to Harbinger's Hollow was a long one. The landscape outside his car window changed as the city faded into the distance, replaced by dense forests and snow-covered fields. As the evening settled in, the temperature dropped and the once bustling roads grew quieter. Kyle's car was the only one on the stretch of highway leading toward the town, and the isolation of it sent an unsettling chill through his spine. As the trees became more sparse and the fog thickened, Kyle found himself wondering if the tales were true. Could there really be something supernatural at work here, or had the people before him simply given in to fear? There was only one way to find out. When Kyle arrived at the outskirts of Harbinger's Hollow, the fog was so thick he could barely see the road ahead. The air was frigid, biting at his skin as he stepped out of the car. The town lay ahead, silent, ominous, and shrouded in mystery. The moment his foot touched the first step into Harbinger's Hollow, he felt it, the weight of the place, the pressure that seemed to press down on him from all sides. It was as if the town itself had been waiting for him, calling to him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and a wave of dread washed over him. Still, he pressed forward. The town had an eerie stillness. The fog swallowed the sound of his footsteps as he walked through the streets. The buildings, dilapidated and abandoned, loomed over him like specters from forgotten time. The windows, shattered and dark, gave no indication that anyone had ever lived here. Yet Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that the town was watching him, waiting for something. He walked past the homes, some with remnants of their former lives left behind. Frozen laundry in backyards, rusted bikes leaning against fences, doors half open as though the occupants had simply vanished mid-action. Kyle's flashlight flickered as he passed by a long-abandoned storefront. The words Hollow Market were barely visible on the decaying sign. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread gnawing at his instincts, Kyle knew he had to find the church, the heart of the town. It had been a focal point in every tale about Harbinger's Hollow, and if there was anything to uncover here, it would be there. As he walked, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The frost clung to his breath, making it almost impossible to see ahead. But still, he trudged on, determined to reach the church. The feeling that he wasn't alone grew stronger with every step. When Kyle finally reached the church, it was just as described, tall, looming, and as cold as the grave. The massive wooden door stood ajar, as though inviting him in. He stepped forward cautiously, his heart racing as he pushed the door open. The smell of decay hit him immediately. Dust, mildew, and the unmistakable scent of old wood, damp from years of neglect. Inside, the church was as barren and forsaken as the town itself. The pews were coated in thick layers of snow, the altar long abandoned. But then his flashlight caught something unusual. There near the altar was a journal. Kyle's pulse quickened. Was it the same journal Gavin had found? He quickly made his way to it, his breath catching his throat as he picked it up. It was the same. The worn leather, the fragile pages. But this time, the journal wasn't as scattered as it had been before. The entries seemed far more deliberate, written with a sense of urgency and fear. Kyle began to read. The hollow has awakened again. It was only a matter of time before it found another soul to consume. I can feel it growing stronger, pulling me deeper into its grasp. The land is alive, and it thrives on our fear. The hollow waits for those who wander too close, for the ones who seek the truth. It feeds on our curiosity, on our desperation. The next page was written in frantic script, barely legible. Gavin Blackwood was a fool to think he could escape. He thought he could uncover the truth. But the truth is far worse than any man could comprehend. The hollow claims us all, body and soul. And when it does, we become part of it, a shadow that never leaves. We are the hollow now. Kyle's fingers trembled as he turned the pages. It has been decades since the first sacrifices, but there are still those who come. They always come, and they are never seen again. I can hear them now, the ones who came before me. They whisper my name. They tell me I will join them. The hollow is hungry, and it will never stop. Kyle's heart pounded as he read the last entry. I fear I am already lost. I hear the whispers of the dead. They are here in the walls, in the air. The hollow has taken its toll, and I will never leave. Neither will you. You can't escape once it's found you. The darkness is already inside. A cold, paralyzing chill washed over him as he realized what the last words meant. The hollow wasn't just a place. It was a force, a presence that consumed everything in its path. It took the souls of the living and bound them to the land, feeding off them until there was nothing left but darkness. Kyle slammed the journal shut and turned, his stomach churning. The church had grown colder still, the shadows creeping closer. He felt a presence in the room, one that sent an icy shiver down his spine. He wasn't alone. The whispers began to rise around him, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves. Then they grew louder, clearer. Kyle. The voices echoed in his mind. He couldn't tell if they were real or a product of his fear, but they felt too real. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if the ground itself had bound him to the spot. Figures appeared in the darkness, shadowy shapes, their forms warped and distorted. The air grew heavy with the presence of something ancient, something hungry. Kyle's breath came in short. Panic gasps as the figures moved closer. He reached for his flashlight, but it slipped from his hands, leaving him in complete darkness. Then he saw it, a face, hollow-eyed, twisted with the agony of 1,000 lost souls. The figure reached out to him, its hands cold and unyielding. In a panic, Kyle tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His heart raced, his mind screaming to escape, but his body refused to obey. The figure's hand grasped his wrist, and as it did, the world around him began to fade, slowly at first, then all at once. The cold spread through him, and he felt the pull of the darkness, dragging him down into the very earth beneath him. Days later, the local authorities received a report of a missing person. Kyle Hargrove had vanished. His car left parked at the edge of Harbinger's Hollow. His camera was found, the footage showing nothing but static, interrupted by a single image of a shadow stretching out in the fog. Harbinger's Hollow had claimed yet another soul, and as always it would wait for the next soul foolish enough to enter. It was months before anyone dared to venture near Harbinger's Hollow again. The haunting tales of the missing, the whispers that seemed to come from the very land itself, kept people away. The town had earned its sinister reputation, and no one wanted to test the truth of the stories. No one except one. Abigail Hart, an experienced journalist known for her investigative work in uncovering long-forgotten stories, had heard the whispers of the Hollow. Unlike the others who had fallen victim to their fear, she was drawn to town for a different reason. To understand why it consumed those who entered, to unravel the real story behind Harbinger's Hollow. Abigail had been researching the town's curse for months. She had pored over old records, spoke to locals, and even attempted to interview the families of those who had vanished, but all had either passed away or refused to speak of it. Every thread she pulled led her to one terrifying conclusion. No one had left the hollow once they had entered. They simply vanished. But Abigail was not a stranger to danger. She had investigated the most haunted places in the world, visited war-torn lands where the past still lingered in the air like smoke. Fear was something she understood, but she also understood the importance of truth. Harbinger's Hollow was a story she had to tell. As Abigail drove down the desolate road leading to the hollow, the air around her seemed to thicken. The wind howled through the trees, pulling at the car like unseen hands trying to steer her away. But she pressed on, her grip tight on the wheel as the town came into view. The fog that had once plagued the hollow now seemed to cling to every building, every tree, as if the town itself were trying to hide. Yet there it stood, silent, still, and beckoning. The moment her foot touched the ground, she felt it, the same oppressive weight that had affected everyone who had ventured here. It was as if the town had been waiting for her arrival, anticipating her every move. The whispers began almost immediately, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves. She paused, her heart skipping a beat. Her instinct screamed for her to turn back, but she pushed the thought away. She was here for answers. Abigail began her walk through the streets of Harbinger's Hollow, the crunch of snow beneath her boots, the only sound that cut through the thick silence. The buildings were abandoned, their windows dark and empty. The wind tugged at her coat as she approached the church, the heart of the hollow, where so many before had come and so many had disappeared. As she entered the church, the temperature plummeted. Her breath was visible in the air, and a sense of unease washed over her. She had read the journals, heard the tales, but nothing prepared her for the reality of the place. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the silence pressing on her like a physical force. The journal she had found earlier, the one that had been left by Gavin Blackwood, sat on the altar as if waiting for her. She approached it carefully, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The pages were yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. The hollow waits. It is not a place, but a force. It is alive, and it consumes everything in its path, time, space, and the souls that wander too close. Those who come searching for answers are nothing more than fuel for its hunger. The curse is not simply of this world, nor the next. It is eternal. The next entry made her stomach churn. We were all warned. They told us not to come, but we thought we were stronger. We thought we could outsmart it, but the hollow is too old, too powerful. It devours our fears, our curiosity, and soon we become a part of it, lost in the darkness, bound forever to this land. Abigail turned the page, her breath caught in her throat. The words on the next page seemed to be written with more urgency, the handwriting jagged and hurried. If you read this, you are already too late. The hollow has found you. It is here, in the air you breathe, in the ground beneath your feet. You cannot run. You cannot hide. It will find you, and you will be one with it, just as we are. Abigail felt a cold chill run down her spine. The journal was warning her what was to come, just as it had warned the others. She had expected fear, but this was different. There was no escape from the hollow. It was a prison, a trap for those who dared uncover its secrets. Suddenly, the air around her thickened, the temperature dropping even further. The whispers began again, louder now, their voices swirling around her in a cacophony of cold, haunting sound. The shadows in the church flickered as if something was moving just out of her sight. Her flashlight flickered, its beam wavering as if the darkness itself was trying to swallow it whole. Then the shadows began to take shape. Figures, tall, thin, and grotesque, emerged from the dark corners of the church. Their eyes were hollow, their faces twisted in agony, as if frozen in an eternal state of suffering. They moved slowly, deliberately, like predators closing in on their prey. Abigail backed up against the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. The figures stopped in front of her, their hollow eyes staring into her soul. She could hear their whispers now, clearer than ever. You are ours now. Abigail reached for her camera, her hands shaking as she fumbled to record the figures. She had to get this on tape. She had to prove that this was real. But as the lens focused on them, the figures began to shift, their forms distorting and warping, as if they were made of smoke and shadows. Her camera's screen went black. Panic surged through her chest as she tried to turn the camera back on, but it was no use. It was as if the town itself was blocking her connection to the outside world. One of the figures stepped forward, its cold hand reaching for her, its fingers elongated and twisted. As it touched her arm, a surge of freezing cold shot through her body. The pain was unbearable, like her very essence was being ripped away. She screamed, but the sound was muffled, lost in the suffocating silence. Her vision blurred as the darkness closed in around her, and the last thing she saw was the hollow, lifeless face of the figure that had come for her. Days later, a search party arrived at Harbinger's Hollow. They found Abigail's car, parked in the same place where so many others had been left. The town was eerily silent, the fog thicker than ever, but there was no sign of Abigail. Her camera was discovered outside the church, still recording. The footage, however, was not what they expected. It showed Abigail entering the church, but then nothing, just static. And in the last frame, before the camera died completely, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes loomed just behind her. Harbinger's Hollow had claimed its latest victim. The town, as it always did, waited. It had been nearly a year since Abigail Hart vanished, and the once quiet reports of her disappearance had slowly faded from the public's memory. Harbinger's Hollow, despite the tales and warnings, still lingered at the edges of people's minds like a bad dream that refused to be forgotten. But for some, it was a place of fascination, a mystery too compelling to leave alone. One such person was Dr. Rowan Sinclair, a historian and professor from a nearby university. He had studied the town's dark past for years, piecing together old records, census data, and photographs that chronicled the slow decline of Harbinger's Hollow. Most of the town's history was lost to time, but there were hints in the archives, a cult-like society, strange disappearances, and rumors of a ritual sacrifice that began as early as the 1800s. Dr. Sinclair was no stranger to the unknown. He had worked with archaeologists in the Middle East, unearthing forgotten civilizations and solving ancient puzzles. But Harbinger's Hollow was different. Its curse, its very existence, seemed to go beyond mere superstition. There was something undeniably tangible in the stories, a dark force that refused to be ignored. When he first heard about Abigail's investigation, he felt a spark of urgency. Her disappearance was the final piece he had been searching for. He'd been working with her journals, going through her findings, and he came to the chilling conclusion that the town's curse wasn't just a myth. It was real. With mounting frustration at his inability to solve the mystery from the safety of his office, Dr. Sinclair decided to go to Harbinger's Hollow himself. Armed with his research and an unshakable determination, he packed his bags and set off toward the forgotten town. The drive was long and uneventful, the terrain growing darker and more foreboding the closer he came to the hollow. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, and the trees seemed to close in around him, their skeletal branches reaching out like hands. Dr. Sinclair's heart quickened as he neared the town, the sense of dread palpable in the air. He reached the outskirts of Harbinger's Hollow just as dusk settled, the sun slipping behind a wall of fog. The old, decaying structures of the town rose out of the mist like silent sentinels, their windows dark and empty. Despite his research, despite his understanding of the place, Dr. Sinclair could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond the curse he had studied so thoroughly. He parked his car near the town's edge and stepped out, the chill of the air immediately biting into his skin. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft shuffle of his footsteps on the snow-covered ground. He adjusted his backpack, feeling the weight of his equipment, a camera, a recorder, and the various tools he brought to document his findings. The town, he thought, had become a graveyard of the past, but he had come here to uncover the truth. The church was his first destination. It had always been a focal point of the curse, and if there were any answers to be found, they would surely lie within those walls. As Dr. Sinclair approached the church, the temperature seemed to drop further, the very air thick with an oppressive weight. The fog swirled around him, moving like tendrils, as if something unseen was watching him. He pushed the large wooden doors open, and they creaked eerily on their hinges. Inside, the air was frigid. The church was exactly as Abigail had described it in her journals, frozen in time, abandoned and consumed by darkness. The pews were covered in snow and ice, the altar long empty. But at the far end near the pulpit, something caught his eye. The journal, Abigail's journal. It lay there, half buried in the snow, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Dr. Sinclair's pulse quickened as he rushed forward and picked it up. He could already tell that this was the same journal that had been mentioned in Abigail's last report, the one she had found in the same church that had claimed the lives of so many before her. His fingers trembled as he flipped through the pages, skimming through the haunting words Abigail had left behind. But something was different now. The words seemed to have changed since the last time he had read them. I've made a terrible mistake. The entry was frantic, the handwriting messier than before, as though Abigail had been overcome by a sense of urgency. The hollow does not just take lives. It twists them, binds them to the land. The souls of the lost wander here, unable to leave. I can feel them. No, I can hear them. They're inside me, in my mind, in my skin. The hollow has claimed me. It will claim you too. There is no escape. Dr. Sinclair froze, his breath catching in his throat. The air in the church felt even colder, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long. His thoughts raced. He had studied this place for years, but this was different. The hollow wasn't just a location or a curse. It was something more. It was alive. He flipped to the next page, his fingers trembling. It's too late. I've seen it now. The truth that has eluded me for so long. The hollow is not a place. It is a being, a force that exists between worlds, feeding on the living, trapping their souls within the land. It does not allow its victims to escape. They become part of it, part of the hollow. Dr. Sinclair could feel the room growing darker, the walls seeming to pulse with an ancient, unnatural energy. The darkness is already inside me. I can feel it growing. It has no shape, no face, but it is there, waiting to consume me completely. And it will consume you too. You are already a part of it. It will always be with you. Dr. Sinclair slammed the journal shut, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the words was suffocating, and he knew, deep down, that there was no way to escape this. No one had ever escaped Harbinger's Hollow. No one. But as the last traces of hope began to slip away, a sound echoed through the church, a low, guttural whisper. It came from behind him. He turned, but the church was empty. The shadows stretched across the walls, their movement unnerving, unnatural. The air seemed to thicken, the whispers growing louder, filling his head with voices he couldn't understand. Then he saw it. A figure stepped from the shadows. A man, but not a man, not anymore. His eyes were hollow, his face pale and twisted, as if frozen in time. The figure reached out to Dr. Sinclair, his outstretched hand clawing at the air as if desperate to pull him into the darkness. Dr. Sinclair tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He felt a cold pressure on his chest, as if invisible hands were crushing him, suffocating him. The figure was so close now, its presence overwhelming, and the whispers became deafening. "Welcome to the Hollow," the words echoed in his mind, and for a split second, Dr. Sinclair saw the truth. The Hollow was not just a place, but a living entity, one that consumed the souls of the lost, drawing them into its dark embrace. And then, just as quickly, everything went black. The search for Dr. Sinclair began the next morning. His car was found parked at the edge of the town, but there was no sign of him anywhere. His belongings were left behind, his camera still recording. But all that remained on the footage was static, until the final moments, when a shadow crossed the screen. The authorities never found Dr. Sinclair. They never found his body. Harbinger's Hollow had claimed another, and the cycle continued as it always had. Harbinger's Hollow, like a darkened wound in the world, persisted. It was a place forgotten by time, but deeply rooted in the land itself, a land that seemed to draw from the very fabric of the universe's darkest fears. For those who had come before, there was no escape. Those who ventured and were destined to be lost, their names swallowed by the cursed silence that blanketed the town. But in the quiet of its waiting, there was a subtle change, a shift, something deeper, something more ancient stirred beneath the thick veil of fog and isolation. And while many had come and gone, lost to its sinister grasp, there were others who were drawn there by forces they couldn't comprehend, forces that had long waited for the right moment the right person, to finish what had been started centuries ago. It was a cold November evening when Claire Weston, an investigative paranormal researcher, found herself standing at the edge of Harbinger's Hollow. She had heard the rumors, read the reports, stories of disappearances, strange phenomena, and the eerie magnetic pull the town had on those who sought the truth. But Claire wasn't just another thrill seeker or journalist after a story. She was a seasoned investigator, driven not by curiosity alone, but by a personal tragedy. Her brother Michael had disappeared a year ago. He had been one of the countless souls drawn into the dark mystery of Harbinger's Hollow, like others before him. He had gone into the town looking for answers, and like Abigail Hart, Dr. Rowan Sinclair, and countless others, he never came out. No body, no clues, just a car left behind and a trail of cold, empty roads leading to the hollow. Claire's grief was now tempered by a burning need for answers. She needed to know what happened to him. What was this force, this entity, that haunted Harbinger's Hollow? And more importantly, was there any way to stop it? Armed with her camera, her notebook, and an unshakable resolve, Claire crossed into the town. The fog wrapped around her like an old, suffocating blanket, and the wind whispered softly, like faint voices from past. Each step she took seemed heavier than the last, as though the land itself was trying to draw her in, to make her one with it. But Claire had come prepared. She had studied the journal entries of those who had come before her, the notes of Abigail Hart, Dr. Sinclair, and the cryptic writings of other lost souls. They all spoke of one thing. The curse of Harbinger's Hollow was not a simple curse. It was a living, breathing force that consumed everything. It devoured time, people, memories, and entire lives, trapping their essence within the hollow. But could it be stopped? Claire made her way to the center town, where the old church stood. The structure, now a shadow of its former self, seemed to be the heart of whatever cursed force held the town in its grip. As she approached, the air grew colder still, and she could feel an unseen presence watching her every move. The familiar sense of dread crept up her spine. The doors of the church were ajar, as they always were. It seemed like the town itself invited her in, as though it had been waiting for this moment. With a deep breath, Claire stepped inside. The church was just as she had imagined, frozen in time, a place where the past had become a permanent fixture. The pews were covered in snow and ice, the altar long abandoned. The air was thick with the smell of decay and dust. Her footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness as she moved deeper into the church, her flashlight casting long shadows against the walls. Then she saw it. At the altar, the same journal that Abigail Hart had written and lay open on the stone surface. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this. This was the key. The answers to everything were here. She walked up to the altar, but as she did, the temperature dropped drastically, the air becoming almost unbearable. The shadows around her seemed to stretch and sway, moving of their own accord. The whispers began, low and indistinct at first, but growing louder. They were everywhere, surrounding her. Welcome. The voice was clear now, cold, ancient, and unyielding. It was a hollow, speaking directly to her. The whispers seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves, from the ground beneath her feet, from the very fabric of the church. You cannot leave. Claire's heart raced, but she refused to back down. She reached for the journal, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked it up. Her eyes scanned the pages quickly, reading the frantic words of Abigail Hart. It wants us, Claire. It wants us all. It does not care who we are or what we want. The hollow feeds on everything, on our fear, on our curiosity, on our desire to uncover the truth. You must leave. You must... The words ended abruptly. There were no more entries, no conclusion. The last thing Abigail had written was a warning, an unfulfilled plea. As Claire set the journal down, she felt a sudden sharp pain in her chest. It was a pressure, growing stronger with each passing second. Her breath came in short gasps. The whispers were no longer distant. They were inside her head, filling her mind with images of shadowy figures, twisted faces, and places that existed in the space between life and death. She closed her eyes, trying to block them out, but the visions only grew stronger. Suddenly, the ground beneath her trembled. The church shook as though something deep below was awakening, something ancient and powerful. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to warp, stretching toward her, becoming solid shapes. Figures that had once been human but were now twisted, their features frozen in perpetual agony. The hollow was rising. With a surge of adrenaline, Claire grabbed her camera and began to record, documenting everything as it unfolded. The images on the camera screen were distorted, glitching in and out of focus, as though the very fabric of reality was starting to unravel. But Claire knew that if she could capture this, if she could record the truth, maybe someone would believe her. Maybe there was still hope. The figures began to move toward her, their hollow eyes locked on her with predatory intent. They were no longer just shadows. They were real. Each one seemed to be made of a shifting mass of dark energy, their forms a terrifying blend of human and something far worse. Claire backed away, but her body felt heavy, as though she were moving through thick molasses. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, drowning out her thoughts. They were calling to her, pulling her in. Then, in a flash of clarity, Claire understood. This wasn't just a town. This wasn't just a curse. This was something far darker, something beyond the mortal realm. Harbinger's Hollow was a place where the boundaries between worlds were thin, a rift between the living and the dead, between time and space. The Hollow itself was alive, feeding on the souls of the lost, trapping them in its never-ending cycle. And she had been drawn here for a reason. The Hollow wasn't just trying to claim her. It needed her. It needed her to complete its cycle. She had to be a part of it. But Claire wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. With a final surge of strength, she turned and bolted toward the door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she raced through the church, the figures still in pursuit, their cold hands reaching for her, their tortured cries filling the air. The door loomed ahead, but was too far. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, the very air thickening around her. As she reached the door, some unseen force, stopped her. She slammed into an invisible barrier, her body jolting backward. The last thing Claire saw was a church, the darkness inside, and the twisted figures surrounding her. Her mind screamed, but her body was no longer her own. The Hollow had claimed her, and the cycle continued. The cold wind howled through the desolate streets of Harbinger's Hollow, but within the decaying walls of the abandoned church, a stillness had settled. The oppressive silence of the town had returned, but it was different now. Something had shifted. The Hollow had claimed another, and yet the darkness it fed off, was far from satisfied. Claire Weston was gone, lost like those before her. Her name, her story, would soon fade into whispers and rumors, carried away on the same wind that had once brought her to the cursed town. But her death, like the deaths of those who came before her, was not the end. The Hollow had always waited, always sought new souls to feed on, always thirsted for the life force of the living. But in the quiet after her fall, something stirred. Something more than the Hollow, more than the malevolent force that had claimed the land, began to shift beneath the surface. The winds carried an eerie whisper through the abandoned streets. Though Harbinger's Hollow had been silenced by the loss of Claire, it was never truly still. There was always something lingering, something left behind, even after the last soul was claimed. And in that moment, something cracked, something broke open. A shift. The fog that had long obscured the town's boundaries grew thicker, its tendrils moving across the land with purpose. In the shadows, something ancient, forgotten, stirred from its long sleep. It was as if the Hollow itself had sensed a change, a crack in its curse. Its hunger had not been sated, and it yearned for more than just the souls of the lost. It needed more. It needed the very essence of life itself. It needed to grow, to stretch beyond a town and claim what was beyond its cursed borders. Far away, in the bustling city, a phone rang. Its shrill tone broke the quiet of an apartment filled with cluttered research notes and abandoned files. A detective, a woman named Margaret Grayson, picked up the phone with weary hands. She had been investigating the mysterious disappearances surrounding Harbinger's Hollow for months, but her efforts had led nowhere. Her colleague, another investigator from a different jurisdiction, had recently stumbled across something curious, something that no one had bothered to consider. There had been whispers. Whispers of the town growing in strength, of the cursed land stretching its influence, reaching out like a dark hand, gripping those who dared to seek the truth. Margaret had heard it all before, but today, something felt different. Something in her gut told her this was the breaking point. "Hello," she said, her voice cautious. The voice on the other end was shaken, trembling. It was hard to make out, but the words, when they came through, made her blood run cold. "It's happening again. Something's wrong with Harbinger's Hollow. It isn't just a town anymore. It's spreading. You need to come. You need to stop it before it's too late." The line went dead. Margaret stared at the receiver, a sinking feeling in her chest. She didn't need to be told twice. The Hollow had changed, had become something worse, something more powerful. If what the voice said was true, if the town's curse had grown beyond the borders of the Hollow itself, then it was only a matter of time before the curse would reach her, before it reached all of them. Back in the Hollow, the fog was thicker now, pressing against the town like an unrelenting force. The shadows that had once been mere illusions were becoming more solid, more corporeal. They weren't just trapped souls anymore. They were a presence. They were watchers. Claire had been the final link in the Hollow's ritual. Her journal, her research, had been the final piece of a puzzle the town had waited centuries to complete. And now, the Hollow was beginning to spill out into the world. But the watchers, those souls twisted by the curse, had changed. They no longer moved in the shadows, hiding from sight. They began to walk, no longer bound by the dark. The wind whispered, but the whispers were louder now, clearer. It was time. The Hollow was no longer confined. It had stretched its reach. Margaret, now standing in her car on the edge of the fog that had begun to creep along the road, could feel the darkness. It pressed against her, not physically, but mentally. The fog was no longer just a weather pattern. It had weight. It carried with it an ancient presence, an old, oppressive power. She rolled down the window and stared out at the dimly lit landscape. The Hollow was ahead. She could see the faintest outlines of buildings through the fog. Her pulse quickened. It was there, and it was waiting for her. As Margaret pulled up to the town, she thought she saw a figure standing on the street corner. A man, gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes. She was too far to make out his face, but something in her gut told her he was no ordinary person. He wasn't a resident of Harbinger's Hollow. He was one of the watchers. Suddenly, the figure turned and began to walk toward her. His movements were slow, deliberate, but there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. He knew what she was, knew why she had come. He had been watching for a long time, and now he was coming for her. Before she could react, her car was surrounded. More figures emerged from the mist, their twisted, inhuman forms shuffling forward like zombies. They were not entirely dead. No, they were something worse. They were the cursed, the consumed, the watchers. The fog seemed to take shape around her, like the land itself was closing in. There was no escape. The town had grown, yes, but it was more than that. It had been reborn. The Hollow wasn't just a place anymore. It was a force, an entity that could no longer be contained. Margaret slammed her foot on the gas, but the car wouldn't move. The fog had already filled the interior, seeping into the engine, clogging the wheels. The weight of it was too much. The watchers crowded around, their hollow eyes locked on her with unnerving, inhuman patience. It was then that Margaret realized. She wasn't just here to investigate anymore. She wasn't meant to stop the curse. The Hollow had been waiting for her, for someone like her. The Hollow was now part of the world. It had found its way into the minds of the living, and it wasn't just looking for souls to devour anymore. It was looking for something else. It was looking for its new host. And Margaret had been chosen. The night in Harbinger's Hollow stretched endlessly, and the fog that had once obscured the cursed town began to thicken, spilling out like an ever-hungry beast eager to devour what was left of the outside world. The Hollow had awakened in full force, a malignant presence that seemed to gnaw at the very edges of reality. But the events had reached a tipping point now. The story was no longer just about a place or the people that claimed. It was about what happens when something so ancient, so malignant, is allowed to grow unchecked. feeding on the lost, the vulnerable, and the curious. Claire Weston had been a victim, like those before her, drawn into the Hollow's sinister grasp. But her death had served a greater purpose, one that the Hollow had been waiting for. Her investigation, her search for answers, had uncovered the final piece of the Hollow's cursed puzzle, unleashing something far worse than the town's previous victims had ever known. As the fog spread across the land, enveloping everything in its path, it was no longer just an eerie weather phenomenon. It was a tangible force, carried with the remnants of those who had been consumed. The spirits of the lost souls swirled through the mist, and with them came an overwhelming, insidious presence. It was as if the Hollow itself had awakened from a centuries-long slumber, hungry for more than just the souls of the lost. It was now ready to consume. And as the fog crept farther into the world, the boundaries of reality began to blur. Margaret Grayson had been one of the last investigators to step into Harbinger's Hollow, determined to uncover the truth. But as she approached the town, her senses began to betray her. The air was heavier than she remembered from her past research. It seemed to press on her from all sides, growing suffocating. The distant whispers that had once seemed faint and irrelevant now felt close, as though they were swirling around her like a storm. The curse was spreading. The Hollow was no longer confined to that cursed town. Margaret could feel its reach, an invisible hand tugging at her soul, pulling her closer with each step. She had come too far, and there was no turning back now. Her flashlight flickered erratically as she made her way toward the church in the heart of the town, the place where it all began. When she stepped inside, the familiar scent of decay hit her like a wall. The once holy structure had long since lost its sanctity, now nothing more than a hollow shell of memories, frozen in time. The altar was covered in frost, the pews long abandoned, they were cracked and rotting. But what unsettled Margaret more than anything was the oppressive silence that filled the church. It felt alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy. Then, from the shadows, the figures appeared. At first, she thought they were human, wandering souls, perhaps. But as they stepped closer, she saw their faces, twisted, frozen in expressions of agony and terror. Their eyes were wide open, black as coal, and their bodies seemed to flicker, like something from a nightmare, not entirely real. They were the Watchers, the souls of the lost, who had been trapped by the Hollow for years, their torment never-ending. Margaret wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The Watchers closed in, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The air around her grew thick and suffocating, and it felt as though her very existence was being drained away by the curse that had claimed the town. Then, something unexpected happened. A whisper, almost imperceptible at first, echoed through the room. "Margaret, you're too late." The words felt like a weight pressing against her chest. She turned, and there, standing in the corner of the church, was Claire. Her once living eyes were now dark and empty, hollow like the rest. But it was her, no doubt. "You should have left, just like the others," Claire's voice whispered, her words laden with sorrow and regret. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribcage. She stepped back, her mind racing. She knew it was too late to leave, knew that she had been drawn here for a reason. But what had happened to Claire? What had the Hollow done to her? I didn't know," Margaret stammered, her voice trembling. "I thought I could stop it. I thought I could save you." Claire's eyes hollowed deeper, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of the woman she had once been. "You can't save us. You can't save yourself." The Watchers moved in, their cold hands reaching out toward Margaret. There was no escape. The fog had spread too far. The Hollow had grown too powerful. The boundaries between the world of the living and the dead had blurred. As the Watchers surrounded Margaret, she realized a horrific truth. The Hollow wasn't just a place. It was an ancient force, an entity that had been feeding on souls for centuries, trapping them in a cycle that would never end. It wasn't something that could be defeated or contained. It was a living, breathing curse, a wound in the fabric of the world itself. And now it had claimed her. The fog outside continued to roll across the land, creeping into towns and cities, suffocating everything in its path. Those who crossed into the Hollow's path would become part of its never-ending cycle, lost, consumed, and forgotten. The Watchers, now stronger than ever, moved freely through the world, their hollow eyes searching for their next victim. And somewhere, deep within the fog, the hollow watched and waited, because the curse of Harbinger's Hollow could never be escaped. It would never end, and it would always call to those foolish enough to seek its truth. The hollow was eternal, and so, too, was its hunger. The winds howled through the trees as the fog thickened, wrapping itself around the once quiet streets of Harbinger's Hollow. It was no longer just a town. It was an entity, a curse, a dark presence that lived and breathed to the land itself, feeding on the souls of the lost. Margaret Grayson stood at the heart of it all, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the shadows closed around her. She had come seeking answers, hoping to uncover the truth behind the town's dark history. But now, she realized, she had fallen into the same trap that had claimed so many before her. The air in the church grew thick, oppressive. The cold seemed to seep into her very bones. The figures around her, the watchers, shifted slowly, moving closer, their hollow eyes fixed on her. These were the souls of those who had been consumed by the hollow of the centuries, their bodies twisted and corrupted by the curse. Their faces were frozen in eternal expressions of pain and terror. Claire Weston stood among them, her eyes empty, her form flickering in and out of existence. She was not the woman Margaret had hoped to save. She was another lost soul, now bound to the hollow forever. Margaret wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The realization hit her with a crushing weight. There was no escaping. There was no stopping this. The hollow was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity. It was a parasite, a black hole that consumed everything it touched, and it had already claimed her. You were always meant to be a part of it. Claire's voice echoed in her mind, her words both mournful and chilling. We all were. Margaret's knees buckled, and she sank to the cold, icy ground. Her mind spun with the realization that she had not only failed in her quest for the truth, but she had also unknowingly become a part of the hollow's unending cycle. She could feel the pull, the weight of the curse wrapping around her, slowly sinking its claws into her soul. And then, as if on cue, the fog crept into the church, swirling around her like a living thing. It wrapped itself around her, tightening like a noose. The figures surrounding her reached out, their hands cold and unyielding, their hollow eyes filled with the endless hunger of the hollow. Margaret gasped as the fog pressed into her lungs, choking the life out of her. She tried to move, to fight, but it was no use. The curse had already begun its work. Her vision blurred, and she felt her body grow numb, her spirit beginning to slip away. The watchers stood around her, silent and unmoving, their cold eyes the last thing she saw before everything went dark. When the fog cleared and the church fell silent once more, Margaret Grayson was gone, just like the others before her. Harbinger's Hollow had claimed yet another soul, and its cycle would continue, unbroken. The town, once abandoned and forgotten, now pulsed with life, dark, twisted life, and the curse that haunted it for centuries grew ever stronger. The watchers, now more numerous than ever, moved freely through the land, their hollow eyes searching for new victims to feed the hollow's insatiable hunger. The fog continued to spread, creeping farther from the town, as if the hollow itself was stretching its tendrils, reaching for the world beyond. And somewhere, deep within the mist, something stirred, something old, something waiting. Harbinger's Hollow had no end. It was eternal, it was unyielding, and it would never be forgotten, because once you stepped into the hollow's grasp, you were never truly gone. You were merely buried in ice. The end.